Welcome everybody to what is in fact the very first public meeting of Kent People Before Profit. And we are dealing with the question of housing. Now, housing, of course, has been a crisis in housing for some considerable time. And the pandemic has merely exacerbated what was already a very bad crisis. Now, tonight we have some excellent speakers who know quite a lot about housing. First, we have Joe Rivoli, who is from the Acorn Community Union, which do a lot of work around housing and tenants. We next have Glyn Robbins, who Glyn is actually a housing worker as well as a housing campaigner and a member of Unite. We have Steve Davey, who is a councillor with Swale Council, who has a particular interest in housing. And we have Georgie Hurst, who are trying to build a group in Margate. Each speaker will be speaking for around about 10 minutes, and then it will be open for people to ask questions, make comments, contributions, and so on. And at the end, I will talk a bit about People Before Profit. So if Joe would like to start.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Joe. I'm a remote organiser with Acorn, the union. So my job is basically just to help launch and organise sort of new groups of Acorn. So just a little bit about Acorn. We were founded in Bristol in 2014, and we're a mass membership organisation, a network of low-income people who are organising for a fairer deal in our communities. So we're an international organisation. But in the UK, we started just as like a few local residents in Bristol trying to tackle slum housing. And we've managed to develop from that into an organisation of thousands of members and groups and branches all across England and Wales. So our members are sort of low and middle income families, renters, workers, pensioners and students, and just generally like working class people fighting together for a better life. Housing is a big part of what we do, but we are a multi-issue organisation. And our members have organised successful campaigns around housing, transport, economic justice and democratic engagement. So at Acorn, really, we think that inequality and social problems, including issues around housing, are all about power. And we believe that the only way to see meaningful action is if we counter the power of organised money and establishment politics with the power of organised people taking collective action. We believe that everyone has a right to a place at the table, and we put community organising at the heart of our fight. Every day we're hearing about issues facing our communities, from rising housing costs, stagnant wages, brutal cuts to public services. At the moment, a lot of people fall into rent arrears due to the pandemic. We sort of organise around our platform, so you can find that on our website, and I'll share that in the chat box. It's a bit long, so it's probably not worth me getting into now, but it's worth sharing. I'll share it after I've finished speaking. But the bottom line of it really is that we believe that wealth is being transferred upwards, and the only solution is for people to get organised and win it back. So we do that through direct action, and we take the view that organising with people affected by an issue in a way that allows them to directly confront decision makers is the best way to win material changes for themselves and for their communities. So our direct action is practiced sort of in two main aspects of our work. So that's campaigning, both nationally and locally, and member defence. So our campaign focus is sort of on wider material change for communities affected by an issue, whether it be working class areas, such as one in Sheffield, whose bins weren't being collected properly, or whether that be people on disability benefits being discriminated against due to landlord mortgage lending policies of big banks, both of which we've had campaigns on and we've won. Our member defence efforts, which are a lot more sort of housing related, are focused on supporting individual members of our union. So this often looks like a dispute between tenant and landlord, from things like stolen deposits to disrepair, harassment, and even illegal eviction. So we take these issues that are felt by like individuals, tenants sort of in their home alone, and we collectivise them by putting into the way that housing is structured in Britain as the source of issues for all renters. And by doing so, we bring our members together to address these issues and the sort of unbalanced housing laws that tenants would otherwise be up against. And so again, you can look on our website for some of like bigger wings, but just briefly, recently we organised Park Hill flat tenants in Sheffield to oppose fuel poverty, to oppose a hike in heating charges, which was inducing fuel poverty. We want to review this hike, and we also want a refund for all the tenants involved. In 2019, members in Bristol successfully organised against the building of a power plant next to a nursery in a working class part of the city. Again, like a big part of housing and the issues around it ties back to like land and what people want to do with land. A lot of our model is focused around sort of bringing those decision-making powers back, or at least influencing them. And in 2018, probably for me, one of our biggest wins, we campaigned against NatWest and a TSB group. We occupied banks' branches of theirs up and down the country, and forced them to drop clauses in their mortgage and the policies that discourage landlords from renting to people on benefits. So beyond all those wins, really the big thing that we're looking to do is to build power. We're not just looking to win a deposit back for someone, or looking to win a refund on energy charges for people in Sheffield. We're really looking to organise people and to build leadership in working class communities, leadership that organises against issues, and like I've mentioned previously, sort of builds collective strength that can oppose organised money and organised politics. So more recently, to do with housing, over the lockdown, we had our community support network. So this was like thousands of volunteers we organised to deliver food and essential items to people who are self-isolating. What we're looking to do now really is to transform that network of volunteers to what we're going to call a community protection network. So that's networks of people across cities that we're in who are trained up in and ready to mobilise for resisting evictions. On that, we are also a membership organisation, like trade unions are in the workplace. This is because it gives members ownership over our organisation. So at every sort of decision-making level, there are democratic votes that come from the members. It also prevents us from relying on any form of like influential big funders, which allows us to like take on pretty much anyone who our members sort of face against, any decision maker, whether that be a council, whether it be a bank, whether it be a landlord. We rely on our dues to fund us so that we don't have to worry about grants being taken away if we're being too bolshy, which is really what we like to do with our direct actions. We build this membership as well through like just extensive door knocking and outreach, basically, by both our members and our organisers. Obviously, when it's safe to do so, at the moment, we're not door knocking. We're focusing on efforts sort of online more than anything at the moment. With our membership structure, really, like on a national level, we practice what's called coordinated autonomy. So that's local decision making at a branch and group level, guided by the aims and principles of the platform that I mentioned earlier. Nationally, it's difficult when I try to think of a word for this, because like we're in England and Wales, but not Scotland. We do have a sister union in Scotland. So in England and Wales, we've got about 25 groups and branches at the moment, and that's from like large cities like Bristol, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, etc., right down to some smaller towns. We're organising in Stoke, Bradford, Aberystwyth in Wales, and we've got a long list of people who are starting to start groups. So part of my job really is taking those groups, all those people who've requested groups, and really building them to the point where they can be a branch and take on some actions and win. So later on, you've got Georgie speaking to you. She's a member of Margate. They're not launched yet, but I've been speaking to her and another member this week about getting them launched. And what I would say is, if you're in Margate, they're taking some great strides to starting a group at the moment, so you should definitely join and get involved. A big part of Acorn is that we don't put too much work on anyone. We want to bring everyone up. So the more members have got, the better, and the more strength they've got as well. If you're not on Margate, but you are looking to join, again, you can get in touch with us, and that's something we can look to support you with doing. So our email is info@acornunion.org.uk. Just shoot an email to our national admin and I'll get back to you. When people do launch, we do a lot of training. So we do training around campaigning, we do training around member defence, all the rest of it. We're just having to be a bit short of our resources at the moment because we are so sort of overwhelmed. But I do really hope that's testament to like how much what we're doing is actually working in terms of fighting issues around housing.
Right, thanks very much, Joe. Now I'm going to call Glyn Robbins.
I mean, I do think it's hard to overstate the seriousness of the situation we're in when it comes to housing today. As Steve said, the crisis, as it's called, it didn't start with COVID, but it certainly isn't going to end with it either. And I guess the main issue for us at meetings like this is to develop a national campaign that is proportionate to the scale of the problem. And when I say the seriousness, obviously one of the things about housing is that it's multifaceted and things are linked. But I think one way of looking at the situation we're in today is to think about the literally hundreds of thousands of people in this country who are currently threatened with eviction through no fault of their own because they've lost income during the pandemic. To put numbers on it, Shelter at the end of last year was saying that around 750,000 households had fallen seriously into rent arrears, thereby effectively lining them up for an eviction order at some point, particularly given that a large number of those would be private renters, so living in circumstances where they have quite weak legal protections and often were already living in substandard and overcrowded housing. So 750,000, but that assumes a landlord going through the lawful process to get an eviction order. And we know that a lot of landlords don't do that. And so there was some more recent research suggesting that 70,000 households have already lost their home since the pandemic began, so in the course of a year. Now, that is something that the government explicitly said that it would not allow, that nobody would lose their home during a pandemic. But it is happening and it will continue to happen, especially as these households with rent arrears move through the legal process. And so there are a couple of, or three actually, core demands that I think we all need to be raising at this point. The first is that the current eviction ban, which is something of a fig leaf anyway, but there is an eviction ban until the 21st of February, needs to be extended indefinitely until the pandemic is over. And secondly, that the government needs to honour another one of its broken housing promises, which is that it said back in April 2019 that it would scrap so-called no-fault evictions or Section 21 evictions, which is what makes it so precarious for so many private renters in this country. And I know Acorn and other private renters groups have been hammering on that for some time. And we really need to hold the government's feet in the fire on this point, because otherwise private tenants especially are always going to be vulnerable to eviction. And thirdly, and this is the one that I think isn't getting addressed sufficiently, is that the accumulated rent arrears need to be written off or cancelled. The government needs to pick up the tab, essentially, because those hundreds of thousands of households are not going to be able to do it. You know, when we think about the way that the government is already lining up to attack the minimal improvements in universal credit, and we're on the subject, well done, People Before Profit and Deepak and Homes for All for yesterday's day of action on universal credit. But we know what this government is like. They are going to try and make working class families pay for the pandemic with their livelihoods as well as their lives. So those rent arrears aren't going away. I was reading about America today, and there's an estimate there that it could be an accumulated £11 billion of rent arrears. Well, it's a slightly different sized country. But I would guess, and it is a guess, that we could be getting up towards £1 billion of rent arrears here now. And we need the government to write that off. And if they need to compensate needy landlords, if there are such things, then that needs to happen. But what must not happen is that private tenants, or any tenants for that matter, are put in a position of being made homeless because of the pandemic. But we need to broaden it out. And as I said, you know, these things are linked, and the crisis didn't begin a year ago with COVID. And I think the key point, and again, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself for Steve or others, but is to try and get politicians, and I especially mean our politicians, by which I mean Labour councillors, Labour MPs, and trade union leaders. I think far too often trade unions have sat on the sidelines when it comes to housing, to take housing seriously. Someone said before the meeting, it's amazing, why aren't there more people here? Well, I don't think we should be beating ourselves up about that. You know, small meetings like this can make a difference. But I think where we do need to attach some responsibility is on our political leaders, within the Labour movement especially, who for far too long have essentially been turning a blind eye, while millions of people have been plunged into essentially housing conditions which we thought we'd left behind, not just in the 20th century, but in the 19th century. And this government, and ones before it, are driving us back to those sorts of conditions that my grandparents experienced. So we need a national movement, as I said, that responds to the scale of the crisis. And there are many different demands. I've mentioned some. One that myself and others have been particularly associated with for a number of years is that council housing, and I mean real council housing, not so-called council housing or so-called social housing or even less well-named affordable housing. I mean real council housing. The sort of stuff that actually, to a large extent, solved a housing crisis after World War II. Real council housing needs to be restored to the policy mainstream, whoever is in power, whichever government. And it's important to remember it doesn't have to be a Labour government, much as we may wish it, to have council housing receiving the kind of investment that it needs. And I think there is a shift. I mean, we have been, I suppose, fighting a bit of an uphill battle on this one, probably since Right to Buy in 1980. And there's a lot of water gone under the bridge. I think perhaps we don't need to rehash some of those arguments, but think about where we are now, where we have approximately, for example, 5 million people on housing waiting lists up and down the country, 1.2, or various estimates, 1.2 million, we could say, households across all of the housing waiting lists in the country, as well as I said, increasing numbers of private renters who simply cannot afford their home, even if it's substandard, even if it is overcrowded, and who I believe, and although a lot of them are of a younger generation that may not immediately associate with council housing, would have your arm off for the kind of conditions that council tenants like the ones who live on the estate that I look after in Islington benefit from. And so council housing is key, but it's not the only thing that we need to do. And all of this, we hope, will come together at a rally and summit that Homes for All are organising on the 19th and 20th of February. I've put the link to the Facebook event in the chat along with the virtual flyer. And the idea of the rally and the summit is to really address this question: how do we build this national campaign that we need? And we've got some great speakers. We have Ken Loach, because we have to, but we also have Kevin Courtney from the National Education Union. I hope talking about why decent, secure, genuinely affordable housing is so important for public sector workers, and obviously included in that for NHS workers and carers. We have a speaker from Grenfell United, and no discussion about housing in this country should take place without remembering that there is still no justice for Grenfell 3.5 years on. But also we have a speaker from the UK Cladding Action group who are there to tell us that despite what happened at Grenfell, there are still thousands of people living in death traps, essentially, or potential death traps, and also having to pay tens of thousands of pounds for the privilege. So they'll be speaking. But more importantly, actually, we have a series of workshops on the Saturday addressing the different themes: resisting evictions, the increasingly problematic role of housing associations, how and where we build the homes we need, universal credit, and the other important campaigns around benefits. So there's a lot going on at the rally and summit. on the 19th and 20th, and everyone is welcome. Homes for All is a non-party political alliance of campaigners and tenants from all different backgrounds. And we're not saying we're the only show in town, but I suppose what we are hoping is that we become the kind of large tent, as it were, within which people can gather to meet, to talk about the issues and how we develop a campaign that is capable of shifting decisively policy in this country, which for far too long has really just condemned working class people to housing misery, and it doesn't have to be that way. Thanks a lot.
Right, thank you very much, Glyn. Next, I'm going to call for Councillor Steve Davey to speak for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, all. A brief introduction, I guess. Local councillor for Swale Borough Council. I joined Acorn over a year ago, and I put their case as best I could to my CLP, my ex-local Momentum group, the Labour Left Alliance, North Kent. Didn't get much of a pickup, and I've had a busy year, as you can imagine. So I haven't really able to get on the front foot as far as recruitment goes. It's a great organisation, and I first heard about it in reading the Morning Star and reading up some of the work they've done for tenants. I've had an interest in housing, rough sleeping, since I was first elected, and it's been one of my go-tos. Many of my questions at council are all based around various problems I think that we have. One of my questions going in a couple of weeks' time is regarding the sale of social housing. One of the residents spotted some sales that weren't properties that weren't listed as belonging to Optivo, although I believe they are, and they're up for sale on sites. And the questions are, why are we selling off housing stock, or why are the social housing providers selling off housing stock when we desperately need houses? Obviously, we know the number of households nationwide. In Swale, it's around 1,500 families on the bidding list. I will say we have a very good housing group within Swale Borough Council, and I can't fault their work. Some fantastic officers. We have a rough sleeping initiative officer, which we installed soon after the Rainbow Coalition took over at Swale. And I try not to make things too political, but they are. I'd attended council meetings prior to the election, and Roger Truelove, who's now our leader, and was the leader of the Labour group under the Tories, who were in charge for some 17 years, asked every year for funds for rough sleepers, and they were never granted. But we bid for funds, and now the annual count listed around 33 people in 2018. In November 2019, we're down to about 11 and 12. And at the last virtual count, which is all we could have, we're down to around 6. One of the problems we have facing homeless people is the lack of social care for many of these people, and they actually refuse to come in. You give them properties, and there's no support for them once they're there. Sometimes there's not even any furniture. In fact, I'm dealing with a case now, someone who's going into a new flat, and they've got nothing. They're going into a bare flat. I mean, it is a private rented flat, but all the charity shops are shut, and so we're kind of shuffling around to see what bits and pieces we can find. As far as providing housing goes, I can only speak from Swale, although I've been to Medway and I've chatted with one of the groups up there. As far as housing goes, we've recently proposed to start our own local housing company called Rainbow Housing. We aim to borrow £23 million from the Public Works Loan Board and build 139 homes within Swale. It's a start. Unfortunately, we don't have the infrastructure to run them, so the actual maintenance and the handing out of leases all will have to go to a management agency or another social housing provider, because when our houses were sold off I believe it was 1990 when they went to amicus, the requirement to have a finance department that looked after renting, and that was all got rid of. Obviously, we know that the real term cuts to local councils or local authorities is over 40% now in the last 10 years, 11 years or so. And we're still now being expected to provide more services with less money. And I think the figures are something like 8 out of 10 could file for bankruptcy under the current COVID restrictions, and around 1 in 5 local councils, only 1 in 5 local councils can actually submit a balanced budget, and we are one of them, I believe. We've got a great 151 officer. It's not going to be the be all and end all, because with the needs to raise funds as a council, we have to have a weathered eye on making a profit out of these houses. And although during scrutiny, and again, I will raise it when the issue comes up next, probably at Cabinet or at scrutiny again, the fact that we have to adhere to the current regulations, as it were, with 6-month short-term assured leases, a number of the houses going out possibly to private housing, and the dreadfully worded affordable housing, as opposed to all being 100% for those who actually need them within Swale. And there was also a clause in part of the paper that said that the council would retain in perpetuity 10% as a minimum of social housing, which I aim to fight against as well. I don't think this is the council members specifically. It may be more an overview from our finance department, because they have to keep an eye on our budget. I've had some experiences, one particular experience with Section 21. I do have some sympathy with private landlords. I do know some. They're not always people who drift into owning property as a business, although I know one. Sometimes they get houses left to them. And for many, particularly as they get on in age, it's an income for them. I do disagree with the severity of the 2-month minimum notice, which is a particularly vicious way of getting someone out your property, irrespective of whether the fact you need the money, you need to sell the property on for maybe an emergency with your own family. The case I dealt with, which was particularly traumatic, obviously for the person involved, but also for me, having never experienced it, I've got permission from her to speak about it. For those who haven't been aware of how Section 21 works, she was 37. She'd been living there for 8.5 years. She had a 10-year-old son at a local school doing well. Number of disabilities in place that meant she couldn't often walk up the stairs. And that includes fibromyalgia, post-Lyme disease, neural tension, and bipolar. So she mental and physical disabilities. And eventually, at the start of 2020, she had to move out. And our team did as best as they could. But unfortunately, as we know, the local housing allowance has been outstripped by the cost of properties. Our local housing allowance is now £749 for a 2-bed flat. And if you look around Sittingbourne, which isn't a particularly wealthy area, your average price is around £900. And obviously the balance comes out of her disability allowance and her universal credit. And this is one of the problems. I'm on universal credit myself. I've been since March, is that it's a get by benefit. There's no room for any slippage. There's no room for emergencies. And in this particular case, she wasn't going to get the deposit because it belonged to her mum anyway. So there was no way she could move on to a new property. She ended up being put in a hotel in Ashford. So driving back to Sittingbourne to take her boy to school, and then temporary housing in Luton in the Medway, where she initially got septicemia from bed bugs in the mattress that was there, ended up in Medway Hospital, and then the ceiling fell in this temporary property. And again, questions I asked the council about how do we check these properties? And unfortunately, the simple fact is we don't have a number of officers anymore to go out and look at every single property, particularly if they're outside the area. You rely on your landlord to provide the accommodation. And again, our hands are tied on what we're allowed to pay per night for either a bed and breakfast or a temporary accommodation. And it's not a lot of money, believe you me. It's down in the like 20 quids that you're expected to pay. So you don't get great property. Fortunately now she's in a new place. But part of the process of moving her out, I found her post on Facebook, and I ended up using my ended up using my van to help her move her stuff into storage, which she has to pay for, and she had to give away a lot of her property and leave a lot out for rubbish. And so if you can imagine, you've been comfortably living for about 8.5 years, and then you end up throwing some of your stuff away. I'll sum up there. I've got plenty of other things to say, but I just made a few bullet points. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Steve. Okay. Right. And now Georgie is going to tell us about happening in Margate.
Hi, yeah, I'm Georgie, and I'm a member of Acorn. And for the last 8 months, we've really been trying to build an Acorn branch in Margate. The main reasons are that Margate, as a seaside town, obviously has the seasonal kind of economy, and with the pandemic that has been worsened because a lot of people's jobs around here are seasonal jobs, and a lot of people have lost their jobs or are on furlough and can't cover their rent. What you got, I'm not sure where everyone here is based, but I think particularly with seaside towns during the pandemic, and this is something that has really amped up our urgency, is that they're desirable places to live during a pandemic. They got lots of space to walk. People in London who obviously don't have to commute to go into work anymore are thinking, well, maybe we'll make that move. We'll move to seaside town. Now I can work from home. So that's obviously made Margate a much more desirable place to live. But it's still a town with very disproportionate equalities in terms of finance. So the cost of housing has risen quite dramatically, and we've mainly observed this through Facebook groups which are advertising private properties. There's a Facebook group called the Margate Creatives Accommodation, and this is sort of where we've been gathering our data, as it were, and kind of observing what the situation is like. So this Creatives Accommodation page, already in the title, is sort of suggesting an exclusivity to who gets these like lovely shiny new housing, and also it means that you can slap up the price by an extra 200 quid or whatever. And so what we've observed is that people are posting on this Facebook page maybe like once a day, 2 people a day posting, looking for housing, and they're putting up what rent they're willing to pay. So you've got somebody from London who's saying, oh, I've got a budget of £800 a month for a 1-bed. I'm looking for a 1-bed, £800 a month. And obviously you've got people who want to rent out their previous Airbnb, looking at that going like, oh, fantastic, I can get somebody in for £800 a month. Meanwhile, local estate agents, they're obviously looking at these pages, and other private landlords, and they're thinking, okay, well, this is what people around here are willing to pay now, so let's start raising the prices. So what we really want to do is firstly build a pressure group, and So build enough people and a kind of presence in the area to show that we won't stand for that. We won't stand for, you know, pricing that's kind of completely outpricing local people, local working people who might have lost their job or are on benefits. Or there's also quite a high proportion of Eastern European communities in Margate, a lot of them who don't speak English and often end up in slum housing, living with multiple, you know, housing with very large families, 1-bedroom flats. And it's a real serious issue, this kind of rampant gentrification. And what we really want to do is connect with these communities, so the communities of people who don't speak very good English and don't know their rights and are being exploited. Equally, communities, and I was speaking with Joe about this earlier today, you know, there is a rise in far-right extremism in Margate, and we've seen that over the summer when there was all the Black Lives Matter protests. There were Nazi symbols being you know, spray painted over Margate, and this is a real concern. And the good thing about Acorn is that it's a non-partisan union, and so we can really connect with these people who are obviously feeling disenfranchised, not necessarily the neo-Nazis, but the people who are leaning towards kind of more right-wing ideologies, and we can show them that, you know, it's not you know, your neighbor who doesn't speak English who is really outpricing you here and reducing your living standards. It's really, you know, the situation of private renting, and yeah, the lack of what's the word I'm looking for, restriction on, you know, how much you can charge for a flat. So I was just thinking about you know, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. Yeah, some statistics about so house prices in Margate and what your housing allowance, the local housing allowance, will give you. So if you've lost your job in Margate and you need housing benefit, you can get £342 for a 1-bedroom property in Margate. Unfortunately, the minimum that you can find a shared bedroom in a shared house is around £450. So that's not good enough. And then, you know, when you're thinking about 1-bedroom flats, it goes up to 500, 550, 600. And there are people, like I said, on these Facebook pages who are saying that they're willing to pay £600, £700 for a 1-bedroom flat. So we are in a bit of a crisis. And also another issue that we've observed is that many of these private landlords, even on these like creative accommodation pages, are saying they don't want people who are getting housing benefit. They're putting no DSS on there, which is obviously illegal. And also with people I know who've been looking for houses during the pandemic and who obviously need shared housing because they can't afford to live on their own, they're being told that no, the landlord would prefer families, so they're not getting housing. They don't want to pay for the HMO, house of multiple occupancy. So yeah, those are the issues. And really what we're trying to do now is build a branch. So to officially launch as a branch with Acorn, you need a minimum of 15 paid up members. Really, ideally, we want more than that, and we want people who are willing to give time. And this is really where we're struggling, is that a lot of people don't have time, or they've never done it before, and they're not really knowledgeable about what is required when you join a union and you really start kind of fighting these cases. So yeah, we've had a few meetings, but it's quite hard to mobilize people on Facebook. Joe's been giving us some good advice, and you know, we're just going to keep. One of the things we want to do is create a survey, and we're going to create a survey to post on all of the local Facebook pages, just asking people about their rental situation, what their opinions are about housing in Thanet, as a whole, because I feel like we might have to branch out to the whole of Thanet, because Thanet as a region has one of the highest rates of child poverty in the country, in the south of England. So if any of you are from other areas of Thanet, we'd really like you to get involved as well. Yeah, I think that's everything. Thanks for listening, and been great to hear everybody else's speeches.
Thank you very much, Georgie. Right, okay, well, there's lots of material there for people to ask questions, make comments, contributions. If you raise your virtual hand, Steve Davey.
Thank you, Chair. I listened to Georgie's speech with interest. I'm not too far away, and some of the Labour meetings I go to, members from Thanet are there, the Kent Left and Labour Left Alliance. One of the stats that I found out when I was, funnily enough, researching around Brexit regarding the effect that immigrants have on housing, etc., was that, I think, and if I remember the figures correctly, 78% of all, obviously we're talking about legal immigrants, working immigrants here, 78% of all immigrants live in private rented accommodation in HMO. So the perception that they put a strain on housing it's a misconception. And I believe they also, the East Europeans alone contributed around £25 million to our coffers. So again, it's this misconception that there's taking jobs and money and houses from us true Englishes, you know. And so it's worth that, sticking that in the back pocket as an argument when this is risen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Steve. Right. Jodie Cole.
Hiya. Thanks for all of that. That was really helpful. Yes, so I am in Margate and I've joined the Acorn Union and I do want to get involved. I'm just not sure how. I've signed up to be a member to, monthly payments. I've done that part. So hi, Georgie. It'd be great to get involved if I can. Yeah.
So what I think I've missed out from the end of that was, after we've got the data from this survey, what we want to do is contact everybody who's joined our Facebook group. So we have the Facebook group with now about 40 members, and we currently have, I think, 12 signed up members in the area, which is really good. So what we're going to do is try and get as many people from that Facebook group to come to a meeting. We're going to talk about the data and the information that was shared with us on the survey. Hopefully as well, we're going to put a contact information on the survey if anybody wants to know anything more about, why we're asking these questions. So so keep an eye out, Jodie, for a meeting we're going to organise hopefully within the next month. And thank you so much for joining. Can't wait to meet you and organise with you.
Well, thanks, Jodie and Georgie. Right, Candy.
Thanks everyone who's come to speak. It's very interesting. Not good news by any means, is it, with the housing situation? But one of the things I'm going to say is how difficult it is to raise these issues when there's a pandemic going on. You can't protest, you can't go around with petitions, you can't go out in the streets and let people know just how bad it is. I live in Thanet, I live in Minster, but I'm well aware of the problems in Thanet and the housing. And just to say, when people argue that immigrants are over here taking housing, they're also the ones that work in the hospital looking after people. They're also the ones working in hospitality. We can't do without them, and we need to value those people a little bit more, I think. As far as building new houses are concerned, I know in Thanet they are planning to get developers to build something like between 4,000 and 5,000 houses. A tiny proportion of those will be what they call social housing, affordable housing, which means nobody can afford them. And what the developers did last time, there was a smaller, I think it was about 200 houses. This was almost going through. with, I don't know, say 15% social housing, and the developers beat the council down so that they could make a bigger profit with fewer social housing. So that it's a real con. You know, councils have got to be really strong about this.
Thanks, Candy. Roger.
Yeah, I don't want to be too negative. Politicians are part of the problem. It's all about the housing bubble, isn't it? And a lot of politicians are landlords, and it's in their personal interest to keep that bubble going so that they can charge the highest of rents. And so they do very little. And I was thinking how if there was a food crisis, people would be rationing the food. There'd be laws saying you've got to ration what you can buy to eat. Well, housing is almost as important as food. And yet we've got people allowed to buy second homes. We've got property that people buy that lies empty. We've got Russian oligarchs buying lots of property in London. So a lot of it could stop by changing the law, limiting the amount of property people buy, putting rent caps on even private renting, as well as council houses, as well as building new houses and flats, of course. But a lot of this is unlikely to happen because people keep voting for right-wing governments that love their housing bubble, and the whole economy depends on it. You know, so that's me being negative, but I just had to mention it. So thank you all for your indulgence.
Thanks, Roger. Steve, you coming back again?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'll come back to a couple of points there as Candy raised. She makes a very valid point regarding Section 106 agreements, which give you social housing if you're lucky. Unfortunately, the developers, they don't like to play ball. And there's some in particular who avoid their 106 contributions where they can. No names mentioned, Persimmon. And in some areas, such as the Isle of Sheppey, they use government calculations to work out the viability. And so if you get a Section 106 agreement on the Isle of Sheppey, you get no houses at all. It will be used for infrastructure because they don't believe they could build a house there and make a profit. Although the big developers who, let's not forget, donated around 11 million, is it that figure, about 11 million pounds to the Tory party since Johnson took over, are now running around 30% profit per house. One thing we looked at in our momentum group was a housing cooperative, but unfortunately, with the lockdown, it's something that's never really got off ground and needed more investigation. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. Francine.
Well, I'm still learning about the housing in Kent in particular, but about housing generally. But I just wondered if you could say something. I mean, I remember it's not that long since we got in this buy to rent, and it seems to me that that's an invitation to have a second home, third home, fourth home, fifth home, which I know people have done. I wondered if there was any sort of campaign again that, have I got the wrong end of the stick on that? And on a more positive note, because the charity shop is shut, there's also, as far as I know, and I think it's probably true, a lot of people who would like to donate furniture to people if there was some central way of doing it. I mean, I know people have offered to give me furniture. I've seen it out on the street. There is furniture available if people need furniture, but it needs to be brought together. And I don't quite know if there's anything set up for that because, it's ridiculous when somebody's got, I don't know, settee on the street and there's somebody else who hasn't even got somewhere to sit on. I'm sure there must be a way, maybe there already is, of trying to bring those things together.
It's landlords have got an awful lot of power because they own the property in the first place, they own the land and things like that. The more people we get into groups like Acorn, the better it is because the more people who get together can fight, the more people you got who can fight back. Until you end the housing market and have a system where you can provide housing according to need, you're always going to get a system dominated by the people who own things. This is a very small start, but it's good to see people organising to fight back. we're very, individually we're very weak, but the more people we can get together to organise, to build groups like this, the more chance we've got of shifting things in our direction. But it's a long way to go.
Ivor.
First of all, to Glyn, you were talking about how obviously council housing and the need to actually increase the council housing stock. And I fully support that as a council house tenant myself, still resisting the onslaught of the Tory heartland of Medway to try and take our 3,000 homes into the private sector. We are resisting with great aplomb at the moment, and they hate us for it. But I was just wondering if there is actually a figure of how many council houses are left in the UK or in England, and if there is an actual figure for that as compared to what there was before the great sell-off started with Margaret the Milk Snatcher. And the other one was for Georgie. You've got some ideas for sort of setting up in the Margate area, but there are structures within the area that could actually support you and help you to promote that. They've got a local trade union council, but there is a structure there that you can use to get out to people through the trade union movement. And indeed, my own union, the RMT, have actually got 2 branches in Margate, one engineering branch, one train crew branch, and they would be more than happy to help get that message out. A lot of our members are low-paid members from cleaning companies and things like that, and so are almost certainly probably in a housing situation that you might be able to support them with and get them involved. So that's just my 2 points. Thanks for that, Steve.
Thanks, Ivor. Matthew.
Yeah, I was just wondering, how can we put pressure on politicians, particularly the Labour Party? I mean, the other week, Annalisa Dodds laid out the plans, that Labour would have financially were they in power. There was absolutely no mention of housing in that at all, and that's from a Labour Party. It's just unbelievable the way Labour's moved at the moment. So who can we put pressure on? I mean, can we target somebody and everybody attack that person and try and get them on side to be a voice? I mean, obviously there are the obvious target people we could target who we think are on the left, but I just wonder, is it worth going to someone, the Green member of Parliament, for instance? How interested would they be in helping us? Because it's looking almost as though they're more left than Labour at the moment. So where do we go with this? Who can we put pressure on? That was just a question generally. Maybe Glyn with the housing group has an idea there on who one can involve. And another question, please, to Steve. What you said was that the council has to make profit from housing. Why? Who actually specifies that? Where does that come from, that diktat? Sorry, Steve, but thanks.
Well, as you're next again, Steve, you might as well. Now's your opportunity to answer.
Thank you, Chair. I'll go back to, I will answer Matthew's question. I'm not ducking it at all. I'm going back to Francine's question about the furniture. Unfortunately, during lockdown, there is absolutely no way of any sort of coordination for getting in furniture. There's a place in Canterbury called Necessary Furniture who take in donations. They come and collect, and I believe they deliver as well. And there's also a KCC run organisation, or actually part of the KCC, that deals with white goods. But again, I'm not sure how active they are. And our local housing place shut down. It was run by Optivo, but because it wasn't making a profit, they shut it down. So we lost that as well. And they were also quite picky on the stuff they took in as a donation. To Matthew's point about making a profit, it's not actually making a profit per se. It's got to be a break even. We have to repay the £23 million, and maximum time I believe you can have is 50 years. So when you crunch the figures based on the prevailing prices for whether you have 100% social housing, or I think the figure they were almost 75% social housing and 25% going out to the private sector, when the numbers were crunched, you have to pay off your debt within that time frame. So that's how it's worked out. It's not a profit per se, but you can't be running at a loss. But obviously, if you can earn some profit from the private sector by letting out some of the houses you build into the private sector, then you can buy more properties, which is the idea that we can slowly build up. As to the question, number of council houses, I couldn't tell you the figure, but I know that around half of the councils in the whole of England now don't have any houses that belong to them. But I believe the number of councils that have started their own local housing companies is up in about the 180s now, because it's obviously a need, and also with the pressure on councils to be self-funding, it is a way of getting an income because you don't get the money from the central government anymore. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Matthew.
Right, no one's got a hand up at the moment, so I'll just throw my little bit in. I mean, Glyn mentioned Grenfell and the appalling situation with so many tower blocks that have the extremely dodgy cladding, which turns out, of course, by the developers or the construction people actually completely fraudulently claimed it was safe when it wasn't. And we see this a lot with developers, that it's a very much a smash and grab operation. You find that they build houses in them just for a quick profit. So riverside views, for instance, are very popular, and they can charge a premium. Also, a nice bit of countryside, they'll get a premium. Even though for most people, you need a car if you live there, because there's nothing else around. And certainly, I mean, floodplains, they're still building on floodplains, which is absolutely astounding, given the real threat of climate change and rising sea levels, which is, and the thing is, they can walk away. They can build the house, and whether it's someone buys it or it's rented or whatever, there is no comeback. They've taken the money, thank you very much, and they've gone, and there is nothing. And the sort of housing that we need. I mean, I've seen a plethora of signs for luxury executive housing, is what they laughingly called it. And you just wonder how many luxury executives there can possibly be to buy these places. And of course they charge premium prices, and I'm guessing that they are expecting people moving out of more expensive areas, particularly London, to come and buy them, because certainly ordinary local people are not going to be in any position to buy them or rent them. Right. Nobody more has got their hands up, so I'm going to come back to the speakers to come back, sum up, and respond to the discussion. So once again, Joe, please.
Cheers,
5 minutes if possible.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks everyone. That was a really interesting discussion. I think I'd just like to reiterate mainly the sort of points I covered earlier with Acorn and our model. I think it's a really good way to deal with a lot of the issues we've talked about. Obviously, a lot of what we're talking about here tends to be sort of systemic issues with housing more widely, which can be a lot to deal with. Like, obviously, no one in this room is going to go out on their own and change this. One thing that we're really successful with is just sort of localizing issues and breaking them down a little bit. And we hope that by doing that and by replicating that across the country, we can really build a movement that can force change. For example, people spoke about cladding. A campaign in Newcastle, a group managed to force a property management company to remove all their cladding and reinstall sort of smoke alarms and fire defense stuff in the building more generally. That kind of organising, really, like on block by block basis, on a city by city basis or town by town basis, is what I feel personally is the best way to deal with this. With the ultimate goal, really, like I covered earlier, about building power for tenants, for working class communities, for the people experiencing these issues. I couldn't encourage you all enough to join. I know that's coming from an unorganised, someone who might have stake in the organisation, but I do it because I really do believe in the model. Georgie and the members there are making great strides in organising a group locally. I know, Stephen, there's a group who want to launch in Swale as well. So if you do want to get in touch with us about that at all, I can send you my email address. Sorry, I think if you don't mind me getting in touch with you about that. And yeah, that's all for me really on that one. I'm not the most informed when it comes to housing policy and all the wider stuff, but what I do know is organising, and I know that organising does work. And I'd love to see some of you on board in Kent, especially. Cheers, everyone.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe. Glyn.
A lot of interesting issues raised there, and I hope some of you will feel you want to continue discussing them at the rally and summit. Very quickly on local housing companies, there's actually over 400 across the country now, but although I understand the reasons for them, I think Stephen and others need to proceed with caution. One of them has already gone bust. That's in Croydon, and there are a number of other concerns as well as financial instability around local housing companies. But what I really wanted to try and do was address the points raised by Matthew and Francine and Roger by answering Ivor's question. I mean, getting at the hard numbers of council homes is surprisingly difficult. I tried to do it myself recently. It's around 1.5 million, and that is, authentic council homes owned by local authorities with permanent secure tenancies. So that's about 2 million people roughly. But I think what's a more instructive way of looking at that, and really links to my concluding points, is to think that, and whenever I mention this to younger people, they do think I'm making it up, but I'm sure there are other people here who know that I'm not, that in 1979, which isn't that long ago, really, in this grand scheme of things, 1979, 80, 1/3 of the people in this country were council tenants. So when I talked earlier about restoring council homes to the mainstream, we don't need to go back, 50, 60, 70, 100 years. It's within living memory that a significant proportion, around 1/3 of the homes in this country, were effectively taken out of the vagaries of the housing market and the bubble that Roger referred to. Now, over the decades, that 30% has whittled down to now something around 5 to 6% of council homes as proportion of homes overall in the country, and about the same again, and actually slightly more now, housing association homes. So, it has been a very dramatic change in housing tenure in this country. But I think, and I want to finish on this, that we need to see this as a moment of opportunity, albeit that we are doing so against such an appalling background of so many people dying, so many people suffering, and indeed, as I said earlier, so much housing suffering specifically that predates the crisis of COVID. That I did, as I mentioned earlier, I do sense that the tide is turning in favour of council housing again, and I'm not just whistling to keep my spirits up. Only the other day, I heard about the CBI, the Bosses Union, talking about the need for a spirit of 1945 as we try to recover from COVID. And obviously in that 5-year period after the Second World War, this country built 1 million homes, and 90% of them were council homes. So again, we know we can do this, but it is about recapturing the essence of council housing as part of a much more balanced approach to housing in general that Roger described, that seeing housing, and I think you entitled your meeting Housing Justice. Yes, housing justice, and seeing housing as an inalienable right that every person in society should be entitled to. And I think that's the kind of language we need to start using now, because one thing for sure about this pandemic is that it won't be the last. And I think we need to think carefully about how our society is going to develop from here. What's going to happen, for instance, to all the speculative private blocks of so-called luxury apartments that are being built in London now? But I'm not sure that the people who they're intended for are ever going to go and live in them, as as was said earlier, many of them might be deciding to go and live elsewhere. So we need to be talking about requisitioning homes now, and bearing that in mind in terms of environmental issues, that maybe it isn't now just about building as many as we possibly can, that the homes are there, but they've not been the homes we need. We need to completely shift the language and the narrative around housing in this country. And don't think that you're on your own in this. I mean, I accept the points that a lot of politicians appear not to be interested, but I, for my sins, sometimes do go and talk to MPs in the House of Commons of all colours, from Tories, Labour and Liberal and Green. And I think if you talk to any politician from any party, they will tell you that the number one issue they see in their mailbag from constituents is around housing, wherever they are, whoever they are. And they know there's a massive problem. And they know that what we've been doing for the last 40 years is not working. And so I think, as I said, we need to seize this moment and say that we cannot and we will not go back to the kinds of housing conditions that existed before COVID and indeed in past centuries, that we want to see a real housing future for working class people that's fit for the 21st century.
Thanks very much, Glyn.
And thank Glyn there for the insight there. I think Matthew asked about what we can do. You can, although it's pretty pointless writing to our MP, for those of you who know him. And we've just set our local plan, and he wants the most of the housing in Faversham, and Helen Watley wants most of the Faversham up the other end. So you can't even get agreement between the two MPs, but you can write to them. I think public shaming works very well. Social media is a very powerful tool. And of course, many of them take notice of using many platforms as you can. And obviously, as the movement grows, the voice becomes louder, which is what ACORN's about, and as well as other organisations are working together as groups, and they're lobbying and taking your case forward. We do need a wholesale shift in the way housing is looked at. Having spent 2 months trying to find a shared flat for my son in London the other year when he was going to do work experience around Holborn, beautiful council houses, absolutely gorgeous council houses, all been bought out privately and all sublet to 5 or 6 tenants in each one. It's the Airbnb thing, isn't it, where they just buy up these properties. One property we looked at, you sharing facilities with 14 other people, and that could be controlled from central government. That sort of they can bring in the legislation to prevent that sort of behaviour.
Thank you very much, Steve. And finally, Georgie.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been really inspiring hearing what everyone's been saying, and yeah, I just want to say that in a time where really there's no political party that's taking housing as seriously as we all take it, that joining a union such as ACORN and trying to empower, local people, and particularly people who are either in marginalized communities or who are just feeling disenfranchised and underrepresented, showing them that they really have the power, and it's not about them as an individual, it's about us as a community, and we need to take the responsibility into our own hands and say that we've had enough, and put pressure on landlords and estate agents and tell them, particularly in a private renting context, because that's where I'm coming from, that you won't get walked all over, that people really do have a voice and they really can make a change. And I think that that's one thing that the past 40 years of politics has made people feel like they can't do anything, that protests don't work, and organizing doesn't work and unionizing doesn't work. But it's not true. It's about, we need to really reinstill that belief in people, and I think that's something that ACORN in Margate can do, at least.
Thank you very much, Georgie. Thank you to all the speakers. I said at the beginning that I would say something about people before profit. Now, I mean, the pandemic is not our only crisis, or housing is not our only crisis. You know, we are in a period of multiple crises all happening at the same time. We want to build back better, but I think, you know, we have to understand an extended economic crisis, which is going to bring more problems for ordinary people. People Before Profit is essentially an attempt to try and bring all the different people together, all the different campaigns, to just coordinate, you know, so that we all support each other. Because, as you know, we're going to fight over housing, we're going to fight over jobs, wages, racism, climate change, all these things. The basic demands to try and it covers quite a wide field. And Kent People Before Profit is very new. I mean, we're just starting, in all honesty. We hope to do many more meetings of this nature on all the various topics, and we need people. If you're interested in getting involved, we have a new email account, and you can send us your details, and we will send you details of our meetings and activities. It is also our intention, once the restrictions are lifted, that we will actually be doing physical actions on streets and everywhere. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Steve.
Nice
Thanks,
to see you all.
Everyone.
Take
Good night,
care.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good meeting.
Thanks everyone for
Yeah,
coming.
okay.
Take
Thanks
care.
everyone for coming.
We'll be in
Bye.
touch.